Ivy Walters was only 9 when she crawled through a hidden tunnel to escape her father, Dr. Charles Walters, a respected psychologist by day and the secret leader of a deadly death cult by night. No one suspected the man who wore a calm smile. In public was orchestrating ritual sacrifices behind locked basement doors, but Ivy knew the truth. And years later, she would return not as a victim, but as the ghost they never saw coming, silently hunting down every last believer of the Circle of the Flame. To anyone in the small town of Maple Creek, the Walters family seemed like the epitome of perfection. Dr. Charles Walters was a well-respected psychologist, known for his calm demeanor and thoughtful advice. His wife, Ellen, was a quiet, nurturing presence who spent her days homeschooling their only daughter, Ivy. Their farmhouse was isolated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, making it seem like a serene, peaceful retreat. Neighbors would often see the family walking together or hear Ivy's laughter as she played outside. They never suspected that beneath the surface, something far darker was at play. Dr. Walters had once been a highly regarded academic, but over time his obsession with unconventional psychological theories led him down a dangerous path. His beliefs began to merge with strange spiritual philosophies, ones that promoted a radical worldview where only a select few could truly understand the nature of life and death. Slowly, he began gathering a small group of loyal followers, former patients who trusted him and believed his radical ideas. These people would come to form what he called the Circle of the Flame. It was a spiritual community, he claimed, where members would transcend the limitations of the outside world and achieve purity through sacrifice and unwavering devotion. The Walters' home became the center of this twisted group. While Ivy was unaware of the cult-like nature of her father's teachings, she quickly realized that her life was far from normal. Her mother, who had once been loving and caring, seemed to disappear more and more as Charles's influence grew. When Ivy was just 6 years old, Ellen vanished without a trace. Charles told Ivy that her mother had moved on to the next life, assuring her that it was part of a greater plan. Ivy accepted his words, never questioning them. But over the years, strange things began to happen. Ivy's world grew more isolated. She wasn't allowed to play with other children. Her interactions with people outside the family were limited to brief encounters with delivery men or occasional visits to town for supplies. The basement of their farmhouse was locked. At all times, Ivy was never allowed near it, though sometimes she would hear strange noises coming from below. Charles would often have meetings with his followers down there, their voices muffled, but Ivy could sense an undercurrent of tension in the air whenever they gathered. When she asked him about it, he would dismiss her questions with vague answers, reassuring her that it was for her own good and that she was too young to understand. But as Ivy grew older, the secrecy only fueled her curiosity. There were moments when she would sneak into areas of the house she wasn't supposed to be, her heart pounding as she explored the hidden corners of the house. One night, she stumbled upon a small journal hidden beneath the floorboards in the hallway. The pages were filled with strange symbols, writings in foreign languages, and unsettling notes about rituals and ceremonies that sounded more like dark magic than anything she had ever heard of. Still, it was the photographs that haunted Ivy the most. They were pictures of people she didn't recognize, smiling families in front of houses, in parks, and at dinner tables. But there was something unsettling about the smiles, something hollow. The backs of the photos were often inscribed with cryptic messages and dates. As Ivy studied them, She realized that the dates matched up with local news reports about disappearances, deaths, and unsolved crimes. And in one of the photos, she saw a familiar face, her mother's. Her heart stopped as she recognized the date on the back of the photo. It was the day Ellen had moved on. Ivy's world, which had once seemed so simple and secure, was unraveling before her eyes. She began to piece together a horrifying truth. The Circle of the Flame was not just a religious movement. It was a deadly cult, and her father was its leader. Worse still, Ivy feared she might be next. The attic had always been off-limits. Dusty, creaky, and filled with forgotten boxes, it sat above Ivy's bedroom like a sealed vault. But after discovering the strange journal and the chilling photographs, Ivy couldn't ignore the growing sense that the attic held more secrets. One grey morning, while her father was distracted in the basement with his followers, she took the risk. The ladder groaned under her weight as she climbed, her hands trembling as she pushed open the trapdoor. A musty smell hit her instantly. Light from a single cracked window illuminated old trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of yellowed books. She moved carefully, her small feet quiet against the wooden floorboards, her eyes scanning for anything unusual. In the far corner, beneath a torn sheet, she found an old wooden box bound with thick twine and a red wax seal long since cracked. It looked out of place among the cobwebs and forgotten furniture, almost ceremonial. Ivy untied the string and lifted the lid, uncovering a collection of neatly folded letters, old Polaroid photos, and cassette tapes. Her mother's handwriting was on the envelopes. Ivy's breath caught as she pulled one out and began to read. The letter started with a warning. "If you found this, I pray you are strong enough to leave." Her mother had written it years ago, describing how Charles had changed from a brilliant but eccentric man into a dangerous manipulator. He had convinced his followers that death was not the end, but a necessary transformation. Over time, he had orchestrated disappearances, convincing his followers to commit unspeakable acts in the name of spiritual purity. Ellen had planned to escape with Ivy, but she'd been caught. The letters grew more desperate, filled with guilt and sorrow. One detailed how Ellen had hidden her journal under the hallway floorboards, hoping Ivy would one day find it. Ivy's hands trembled as she pulled out the photographs. They showed families, couples, and individuals, some in group gatherings, others standing alone in front of the farmhouse. On the backs of several were the same symbols Ivy had seen in the journal. Some had dates that matched the ones in the newspaper clippings she'd quietly collected over the past year. But the most horrifying discovery was a single photo of Ivy, herself, taken without her knowledge. On the back, her name was written in her father's sharp handwriting, alongside the words, "Final Offering, Autumn Equinox." She dropped the photo. Her heart raced as a cold understanding settled in her chest. Her father wasn't just the leader of a cult. He was preparing to kill her. Everything he had taught her was a lie. Every restriction, every strange ritual, every locked door, it all led to this. He had already sacrificed others, and now she was to be the ultimate sign of his devotion, his own daughter. But Ivy didn't cry. She didn't scream. Something inside her shifted. Instead of fear, she felt a quiet fury begin to grow. She realized she had time. The equinox was still weeks away. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. For the first time in her life, Ivy understood what she was truly up against, and she began to plan. The night of the autumn equinox arrived with a thick, oppressive silence. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Ivy had spent weeks pretending everything was normal, smiling at the right moments, asking innocent questions, following routines without resistance. But underneath it all, she had been preparing. She knew where the keys were hidden. She knew the schedule of her father's followers when they met, how long they prayed, and what rituals they practiced before a ceremony. Most importantly, she knew that on this night they would be too distracted to notice her slip away. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Ivy lay in her bed fully dressed beneath the covers. When the chanting began in the basement, low and rhythmic, she quietly slid out of bed and tiptoed to the hallway. The house was dimly lit with candles, the scent of burning herbs filling the air. She moved silently, her small frame blending into the shadows. Her father and the others were downstairs, gathered around the altar for what they believed would be the final offering, the moment Ivy would transcend. But she had no intention of joining them. She crept into the storage room and lifted the heavy rug covering the trapdoor. This was the final piece of her plan. She had discovered it weeks earlier, an old passage once used for firewood deliveries that had long been forgotten. With effort, she pried the door open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. She gripped her flashlight and lowered herself into the passage, heart pounding in her chest. The walls were damp and cold, closing in on her with every step. Roots dangled from the ceiling like fingers reaching down to grab her, and the air smelled of earth and mildew. She crawled on her hands and knees, careful not to make a sound. The tunnel seemed endless, but she kept going, counting her breaths, focusing only on survival. Behind her, the chants continued to rise in intensity, unaware their ceremony was unraveling. At last, she saw faint moonlight ahead, an opening. She pushed herself forward and emerged behind the old barn, her clothes torn and knees scraped, but alive. She ran. The woods loomed around her, but she didn't hesitate. She had memorized every tree, every dip in the path. Hours passed as she moved through the forest, her breath sharp in the cold night air. Finally, she reached the highway. Ivy stood at the edge, trembling, until headlights appeared in the distance. She stepped into the road, forcing the car to slow down. A patrol officer stepped out, shocked to see a young girl in the middle of nowhere. What followed was chaos. Police returned to the farmhouse with Ivy's directions. What they found was unlike anything they had seen before. Symbols carved into the walls, ceremonial robes, blood-stained floors, and hidden graves in the forest. 7 bodies were exhumed over the next week, each linked to a missing person case. But Charles Walters was gone. He had vanished, along with several core members of the cult. Ivy was safe, but the man behind it all had escaped, and the nightmare wasn't over. After Ivy's escape, the story made national headlines. News outlets labeled it "The Cult in the Woods," and for weeks the Walters farmhouse was surrounded by reporters and forensic teams. Ivy, now in protective custody, was given a new name and relocated to another state. She was placed with a foster family trained to work with traumatized children. Though safe, she was far from okay. Ivy barely spoke. She didn't eat much. Nightmares came regularly, and she often woke up screaming. The people around her assumed she needed time, that healing would eventually come. But Ivy wasn't just grieving or scared. She was thinking. The police believed Charles Walters had fled the state. using forged documents. Despite a nationwide manhunt, no solid leads ever surfaced. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The cult's remaining followers were either arrested or claimed they had been manipulated and were unaware of the murders. Several walked free. Ivy knew the truth. These people were just as guilty as her father. But without proof, justice was incomplete. Over the next few years, strange deaths began to occur across different parts of the country. A man who had once led ceremonies for the cult died in a suspicious fire. A woman who had served as Walter's second-in-command was found dead in her home, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. Investigators noticed patterns but had no suspects. Most brushed them off as coincidence or assumed someone from within. The cult was trying to silence members. What no one realized was that Ivy had not let go of the past. As she grew older, she used the internet to trace the lives of the cult's survivors. She searched public records, scoured social media, and followed online forums. Many of them had changed their names, but Ivy always found them. She kept detailed notes, connecting each person to specific crimes, each timeline to a body found in the woods, each lie to one of the graves behind the farmhouse. By the time she was 16, she knew everything the police didn't, and she was ready. 2 more ex-cult members died within months of each other. Both deaths were ruled accidents, one an overdose, the other carbon monoxide poisoning. But investigators noticed something strange. At both scenes, they found photos from the farmhouse burned at the edges, with a single red circle drawn on the back. It was the same symbol found on the walls of the Walters' basement. Police began to suspect that someone was taking revenge. Ivy's name was never mentioned publicly, and her identity remained sealed. But within law enforcement circles, whispers spread. Some believed she had resurfaced. Others thought a surviving family member of a victim was hunting down cult members. But there were no leads, no evidence, no fingerprints. Whoever was behind it was careful, precise, determined. By the time Ivy turned 17, half of the cult's known members were dead. The rest had gone into hiding. Ivy had become a ghost, moving quietly from place to place, always watching. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was making sure no one else would suffer the way she had. The last person Ivy had to find was the man who had started it all, her father. For years, Charles Walters had evaded capture, moving from state to state under false identities, avoiding security cameras, paying in cash, leaving no digital trace. But Ivy had never stopped searching. She had studied him better than anyone. She knew how he thought, how he spoke, what he believed in. And more importantly, she knew his weakness, his obsession with being remembered, with leaving behind a legacy. Ivy began tracking places connected to his old writings, remote retreats, abandoned churches, forest properties sold under shell companies. One location in northern Oregon caught her attention. A small cabin bought under a fake name matching one of the aliases used by a former cult member who had died months earlier. There were no utilities connected to the property, no phone lines or internet. Just a dirt road leading into dense forest, far from the nearest town. In the dead of winter, the cabin went up in flames. Firefighters arrived too late to save it. Inside, they found a body burned beyond recognition, but dental records confirmed it was Charles Walters. The official report listed the cause of death as accidental, possibly a heating malfunction or faulty generator. But investigators quickly noticed something unusual. On the wall of what remained of the living room, carved into blackened wood, was a single phrase, The circle is broken. No matches for the carving tool were ever found. Authorities questioned whether the fire was truly an accident. There was no sign of forced entry, no accelerants detected, and no indication that Walters had tried to escape. In fact, the position of the body suggested he had been sitting calmly when the fire began. The mystery deepened when someone discovered a flash drive buried in a waterproof container near the edge of the property. It contained dozens of files, scanned journal pages, cult member rosters, victim names, locations, and even video recordings of rituals. The source of the flash drive was anonymous, but experts noted that the writing style on the documents closely resembled the blog posts from a website that had appeared months earlier under the name Flame Witness 9. The blog had published entries detailing the history of the Circle of the Boar, Flame, the lives it destroyed, and how justice had come to each person involved. The tone was clinical, factual, and hauntingly detailed, someone who had seen everything firsthand. Then the blog went dark. Police followed every possible lead, but Ivy was gone. Some believed she had perished in the cabin fire, somehow tricking investigators into identifying her father as the victim. Others were convinced she was still alive, simply disappearing once her mission was complete. Over time, the media moved on. The blog disappeared, and the case was quietly closed. But now and then, across online forums about cults, abuse, and survival, users would report receiving anonymous messages. They shared documents, timelines, and warnings, evidence that someone was still watching. Someone who remembered every name, every face, and every lie. Ivy had escaped her father's cult at 9 years old, but she had returned with purpose. Not to hide, not to run, but to end what he started, and to make sure no one ever started it again.